Yeah.
Hi there.
Gary Frazer.
John Houck.
Good to meet you or see you again. I know we've met before.
That's right. So we're waiting for one or two more. Assuming they're here.
Gary? Hi, Gary. Gary Frazer. Yeah.
They're coming up the other way.
Ethan Lane, John Houck.
Nice to meet you.
See you again? Yep. See you again.
Missing one. Yeah, we're missing a panelist. We need him.
Yeah, that's what he's talking to.
Felt like they weren't, their story wasn't.
We're missing a panelist. We're working on it.
Is it my turn?
Yeah, it is. All right, welcome.
Thanks, John.
Okay, let's get started here. Now, this is the panel. It's a bit different. No opening remarks. I've got some questions some of us were able to talk about in terms of getting a good discussion going that I will ask, but we want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions this time because there should be, because we don't have to have too many remarks at the beginning. Now, kind of the overarching things we were asking people to think about, and they're general, but they're important, is what can be done to improve species conservation efforts and implementation of the Act, and perhaps even more importantly, how these specific ideas to improve conservation efforts and the efficacy of the Act could be realistically implemented. In other words, how do we get the stuff actually done from idea to something on the ground? Let me introduce the panel, and then we'll get started. Doing double duty that hopefully the Western governors acknowledge is Bob, Broscheid again, recovered from the first one. Then next to him is Carey Farmer, the Assistant Director for Endangered Species, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. A tough job. Then Jonathan Houck, Commissioner from Gunnison County. Carey Farmer, Gas Plants and Commercial Manager, ConocoPhillips. Ethan Lane, Executive Director, Public Lands Council, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and John Gale, Conservation Director, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. That's our panel. So let me start it off with Gary. Okay, and over the past few years, Gary, the Fish and Wildlife has tried to address concerns with ESA implementation through regulatory and policy changes. Question mark. Could you give some insight into exactly how and why your agency is proceeding with this to ensure that the input of states is considered outside of the traditional commenting process? That's kind of a big question, but I figure I can repeat it if it's too long. So go ahead.
Well, let me start by describing what we have been doing over the course of the last 6 or 7 years
to improve the effectiveness of the Endangered Species Act, we are using our administrative authority in the executive branch to affect policy and reg revisions that will make the act work better. We really are not viewing the legislative approach as a very viable approach for affecting change in the ESA in the near term. There's been efforts in the past; they've mostly failed. We have a lot to improve the effectiveness of the act, and what we have as our overarching goals is to make it more effective for conservation of species that are in trouble, but also to clarify and make more consistent the way in which we administer the act, to reduce administrative burdens when we can, very purposely trying to reduce the amount of conflict and litigation associated with the act as well. And while there's certainly been a lot of opinion about our multi-species settlement agreements 6 years ago, that has had the effect of creating a much more predictable and less litigious environment for us to do the work under the Endangered Species Act. That was one of the things that really was our focus in the initial years, to reduce the level of conflict and litigation. But overarching all of this is our efforts to administer the act and have our regs and policies reflect our desire to encourage partnerships and innovation and cooperation in species conservation, with the ESA as a driver for those. State Fish and Wildlife agencies are special partners to the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're not just another stakeholder. They are the agencies that have management authority over most fish, wildlife, and plants before they're considered for protection under the Endangered Species Act. Their special role is recognized in the statute in various sections. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has long recognized that. We had a policy back in 1994 that laid out chapter and verse through all the sections of the Act, where there are opportunities for effective engagement and cooperation with state fish and wildlife agencies in delivering the Act. There have been a number of changes since 1994, again, done through administrative authority, things like developing safe harbor agreements and candidate conservation agreements with assurances and other voluntary conservation tools. The use of habitat conservation plans has increased dramatically since 1994, and many states have also had their statutory authority for species conservation, particularly for not traditionally hunted and fished species, expand. So in the last 6 months, we updated that 1994 policy, and just 2 or 3 weeks ago, we published a revision to that again reflects the special partnership that we have with state fish and wildlife agencies in species conservation, including through the ESA. We also, 6 years ago, developed what we call our State Federal Joint Task Force on ESA policy, which is an executive level body, state directors, regional directors, assistant directors, and the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and comparable level from National Marine Fisheries Service to meet on a regular basis to discuss at the executive level delivery of the Endangered Species Act, accomplishing species conservation, how we work more effectively to establish a collaborative partnership in doing our work. And when the Fish and Wildlife Service initiates new policy or reg revisions, those are all vetted through that joint task force. So we have the advantage of early involvement and insight from our state colleagues as we move forward. We recognize, though, the states are resource limited as well. They don't have an abundance of staff and dollars that are unencumbered. So we are working together as effectively as we can, but there are also a common recognition that species conservation takes a lot of parties to be effective. Local governments, other federal agencies, industry, and private landowners as well are essential partners for species conservation. And so we work on a number of fronts to engage those parties as well.
Gary, thanks. Jonathan, so from your perspective, do you agree that local governments have that real opportunity to be strong partners and leaders in conservation efforts? And have you seen that sort of evolve from your own experiences?
All right, well, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to have some time to speak about local government and how local government can be part of a solution as we address issues around species concern. Gunnison County is in south central Colorado. It is a large county. It's the 5th largest county in the state. 85% of the county is public lands, and 85 to 88% of all Gunnison sage grouse are in the Gunnison Basin. So there's 11 southwest counties, some in southeastern Utah, the rest are all in southwestern Colorado, where the Gunnison sage grouse lives. And I think that if there's a place that we've learned from our experience with Gunnison sage grouse of where the local government piece is really essential, and sometimes the opportunity is missed out on because it's an underutilized resource, I'd point to 2 really important things. One is local government has the ability to regulate on public land. And when done well and when done in a fashion that works with landowners can really move the needle on species conservation. And secondly is the relationships that local government has moving up with the state and down to the local landowners and the local land use opportunities in their counties and in their jurisdictions. As far as a good example of how it works, Gunnison sage grouse, range-wide, a little less than 50% of what has been recognized as critical habitat is on private land. And in the Gunnison Basin, the stronghold of the species, 30% of the most important habitats, so we're talking leks, brooding, winter, the full range of habitat is on private land. And when you look at the tier 1 habitat in the Gunnison Basin, that's the habitat that's the best of the best. Local government working with our partners at Colorado Parks and Wildlife and Department of Natural Resources, working with NRCS, on private land, over 90% of that top tier private land has either some type of conservation easement, conservation agreement, or is enrolled in the candidate conservation agreement with assurances program. Those kind of outcomes come through relationships. And I think that's the second most important piece is when you start cultivating relationships over time, we start moving away from being focused on what could be perceived as heavy-handed regulation or that kind of coming to the local level from folks higher up that don't understand your community. And you start shifting towards what we like to refer to in the Gunnison Basin as a culture of stewardship. Landowners, through our land use regulations on private land, industry are invited in to be part of a solution. And that's a fundamentally different approach than a heavy-handed regulatory approach. And so when we look at opportunities, when communities are willing to sit down and have that conversation with their neighbors, when they're willing to sit down with their ag community or the extractive industry or the recreation community, when they're willing to be the broker of those conversations and those ideas and bringing forth possibility, big changes happen on the landscape. You know, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the state in cooperation with the landowners, they're the ones that negotiated a certificate of inclusions in the CCAA program. And so Colorado Parks and Wildlife in Gunnison Basin and in the Gunnison sage grouse habitat is considered a trusted partner. And that trust is built through that relationship building. And I think that's one of the critical pieces, but I think we often leave local government out of the discussion. And local government really can, with their ability to be a convener and also to work with landowners, has to be a key component. And it has to, in the Gunnison sage grouse, it flows very well between the local communities and the state, but we need more opportunity to have that flow even to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so when we got to our listing decision, 11 counties were all working actively on joint agreements executed and supported by the state of Colorado and the state of Utah and both governors. But we didn't get much traction with those efforts. And so we need to find ways to build that collaboration up to the federal level and make the same connections, meaningful connections with local government that we've seen at the state level.
Thanks, Jonathan. And you said something that leads to this next question, which really can be for anybody. When you mentioned culture of stewardship, but the question is, counties and individual landowners have an immense opportunity to be strong partners and leaders in conservation efforts. But the culture must change from that of an adversarial relationship with states and federal agencies to one where local landowners both embrace and willingly conserve species in concert with the states and the feds. How do we change the culture? And is it replicatable? And is it dependent on specific relationships that exist among specific people in a specific area? Is it impractical elsewhere? You know, is it really luck, timing, and relationships that have a lot to do with this? Or is it going to grow throughout the West and maybe even other places, this change in culture? I know that's a tough question, but any insights? I think we'd all love to hear about that. You're nodding, though.
Well, I'd offer one thought. The Endangered Species Act is a law that was crafted to protect species that are in danger of extinction, and is largely built in kind of a risk-averse mode. Decisions need to be made in a timely fashion. Critical habitat designation needs to happen concurrent with or soon after a listing. Recovery plans need to be built. Consultations need to occur within certain timeframes. These are all mechanisms in the Act, the requirements of the Fish and Wildlife Service that are required by law. And it's those sorts of timelines and the sort of risk-averse approach that is difficult to reconcile with bringing communities together that haven't had experience with the Endangered Species Act or species conservation. And that's where, in many cases, there's a disconnect between what the law requires of us and what we all are wanting to accomplish, which is effective conservation of the species that's locally supported, community-driven, incentive-based. Those sorts of things are what we're all trying to get to. It's easier if we can accomplish. It's easier to accomplish those if we can get ahead of the curve. That's why the service has really been trying to be much more predictable about what we will be doing in the future than we've had in previous years. One of the benefits, at least we view, one of the benefits of our multi-species settlement agreement is that we were able to lay out a work plan so people could see what we're going to do, and that people had time to anticipate ahead of our actual listing determinations that this species was going to be considered for listing and invest before we're in the middle of a listing determination, so that the temperature is lower, the opportunities for collaboration are much greater, the potential for agreements to be reached without having the time pressures of an endangered species listing imposing themselves in the process are much less. So engaging early, and that's where having state fish and wildlife agencies, local governments, and others that can anticipate and serve to bring parties together to address species conservation before we have to engage in a listing determination is so important and so valuable.
Anyone else like to?
Yeah, John,
go ahead.
I don't know if this is attached to the cultural aspect that you brought up or not, but I think one thing that we've seen in the last decade or so that may be related to this is the idea of looking at what's possible outside of the Endangered Species Act before it gets to rescue mode, before we call in the ESA to rescue a species. I think there are a lot of very collaborative things going on that we could focus more attention and time on that help identify ways to protect intact habitats at a large scale, look at landscape level conservation planning for future stewardship, and involve a wide variety of stakeholders from industry to NGO partners to government agencies, both state, federal, and local. And if you look at things that are occurring right now, like with Governor Mead's leadership and his colleagues in Wyoming, the wildlife migration initiative going on there, looking at big game species in particular, getting ahead of problems before they become problems, acknowledging that we have the technology and data, some of which grew out of the Western Governors Association's early days, looking at critical habitat mapping. And let's identify places where we can avoid problems in the first place. Avoidance is always better than mitigation. And let's plan for things at a landscape level instead of a unit by unit level, which I think gives oil and gas and other industry interests greater regulatory assurances while also prioritizing the needs of fish and wildlife habitats. So I think that there's a a cultural obligation that we have collectively to commit to looking at things like that before the ESA comes into play and ties our hands in some ways, but also puts wildlife species into rescue mode. And I'd like to see more of that take place. And I think that it's indicative of the sort of Western culture and our way of doing business out West is let's create homegrown solutions that get out in front of problems. Let's be more predictive, and let's maybe perhaps think about things in a more holistic way that helps us avoid problems in the first place while taking care of stakeholder interests up front.
Jonathan, you were going to go ahead.
The one part I wanted to add, I think you have to round out the discussion. Collaboration, as we all understand, is one of the most important keys to actions on the ground that make meaningful, that really move the needle for a species and protections. But the litigation environment we're in as well has to be addressed at some point. And the Gunnison sage-grouse situation, in 2006, the Gunnison sage-grouse, it was determined not warranted for listing. If the communities involved in Gunnison sage-grouse protection's sole goal was to dodge a listing, efforts would have stopped in 2006. Between 2006 and now the current listing of threatened, regulatory mechanisms actually increased. The amount of lands being conserved increased, the conservation easement programs, the investments from the state, from NRCS, from our partners continued. And they continued because at some point that cultural shift had happened. And what had happened is we're responsible for this species. This is part of our landscape. And we did not allow it just to be a discussion about one single part of our landscape or economy. It was a ranching issue, but it was also a recreation issue. It was a water issue. This was an issue for the university and its research in our community. It was across the range. It became an issue for everyone. It becomes part of the discussion and all kinds of land use planning. And in order for those things to continue and have faith that people will continue to gather like that and make those pieces happen, the litigation and the pressures of the litigation timeframes is what I'm speaking to. I mean, I understand where the litigation is derived from, but when the timeframes become so compressed and the people that have spent years and years, in some of these communities, 25 years building these coalitions, when litigation doesn't allow them the ability to breathe and get to a point of solving some of these issues that they've shown time and time again they can, collaboration can only go so far without that undue pressure from litigation.
Anyone else want to chip in? Go ahead, Carey.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, weighing the relative merits of life under an ESA listing with a 4D rule versus RMPs and land use plan amendments like we've seen on the sage grouse is sort of like weighing relative merits of different options for amputation. Either way, you're still going to lose the limb. So until we start actually talking about how to make the ESA function properly and operate without the litigation pressure and without this sort of lack of focus on recovery and delisting, it's hard to get stakeholders to really want to engage in a substantive process of collaboration and cooperation if they don't feel like those good faith efforts are going to be met with some sort of regulatory certainty and some sort of path forward. If that process can be derailed through litigation just like that, it doesn't build the kind of trust and goodwill that you need to really have stakeholders stay involved.
Carey, let's get you involved here. Got a question. From your perspective, how do we take the success of the Sage Grouse Initiative and expand the level of collaboration and involvement of private interests to other species or landscapes? Is this applicable beyond sage grouse, or does success, again, depend on unique circumstances that vary by species, by landscape, by people?
So to answer your second set of questions first, I certainly do think that the outcome on sage grouse can be replicated for other species and other habitat types. I think that the secret of success to the sage grouse initiative was having a landscape level plan that with conservation practices that were well accepted by landowners and ranchers. I think our landowners and ranchers do have a culture of conservation. They just need technical assistance and cost sharing. The Sage-Grouse Initiative had a plan that was, so they identified the critical practices, they identified the critical habitat, but beyond that, they had an execution plan. They had acreage goals, they had timetable, and they were able to take that to the service and vet it with the service, asking the question, is this gonna get us where we need to be? And that's the characteristics of a plan that are necessary for other species. Funding is always an issue. The Sage-Grouse Initiative benefited from a great deal of funding from NRCS for widespread replication of the Sage-Grouse Initiative. There will need to be additional funding. There'll need to be funding, well, from NRCS. BLM will have to provide some funding, and industry will have to provide some funding as well. And I think there's quite a few efforts around the West to establish compensatory mitigation mechanisms. I think that's a very good mechanism for bringing industry into funding these initiatives. And I'm in oil and gas industry, but I think industry broadly defined can be incorporated in these initiatives. And then the last thing you need to replicate a Sage-Grouse initiative is you need an effective implementation organization. It really is really complicated to get work going on hundreds or thousands of individual ranches and farms. It takes a big organization and an effective organization to get that work done. And that is one thing that the Sage-Grouse Initiative had through WAFWA, through Intermountain West Joint Venture, and the NRCS itself. They had perhaps upwards of 100 people providing technical assistance and enrollment of individual landowners, and that was absolutely critical for that effort.
So, something that'd be interesting to get how people think about the results of the Gunnison sage-grouse. As an example of local community embracing the idea of partnership and collaboration, but here, did the decision by Fish and Wildlife to ultimately list the bird as threatened under the ESA damage any of the goodwill that was fostered through the process? As a result of the listing, are landowners reverting back to some sort of a mentality of reluctance to engage with state and federal conservation efforts? What's been learned?
I guess I get to lead on that.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I think oftentimes folks want the discussion to be, the listings happen, everyone was working hard, now no one's interested. And I think that the conversation is actually much more nuanced than that. What we're seeing across the range is that because we crossed that, what I referred to as that threshold earlier, that culture of stewardship, what you're seeing is people are continuing on the landscape level to do the good work. Our ranching community, the recreation community, our land managers, Parks and Wildlife, the work's continuing. I think what we're seeing though is that there is a very definitive lack of faith with the service that we're going to be able to ever push it over the finish line and have this species delisted. And as communities, we understand that taking that responsibility on ourselves, partnering with the state and our land managers and the federal government is a big task, and it's one that we're willing to take on. When we were getting close to the deadline, which was driven by litigation for the listing of the Gunnison sage-grouse, the 11 counties had come together. Gunnison County had been the focus of all of the actions, and we did that in what we felt was good faith direction from the Fish and Wildlife Service. You must focus on the Gunnison Basin. Over 85% of the birds population is there. And by everyone's measures, including the service, we were incredibly successful. As we got close to the listing decision, it was very clearly recognized that the listing decision would hinge on the 6 satellite populations. So we began deploying all those resources, all of those type of plans, all those type of actions to the greater satellite population. We had focused where we believe the focus needed to be. When that goal was expanded, that's what we did. But what happened was the timeline of the litigation got us to a point where you had 11 counties, 2 governors working really, really hard to bring this piece together. We didn't end up short of meeting goals. We ran out of time. And that's the piece that really needs to be recognized. So it's a long answer to a short question. Are the communities committed to the work that they're doing? Yes, because they believe that stewardship is their responsibility. And we have good partners in that. Our hope is that whether it is through the current litigation or whether it is through next steps, that we get to a point where we don't diminish that desire that the local communities have to be the #1 protector of the Gunnison sage grouse in their actions and the things that they do on the ground.
And I agree with what the commissioner was saying too, but from an agency side, certainly he knows the local government and local feelings of what's going on. But and being part of and being co-lead with our efforts to conserve the Gunnison sage grouse and all the things that the commissioner mentioned, certainly the decision made us reflect on having the science and having that huge lift of conservation that went forward. Certainly with some of those landowners, our credibility was on the line as well. Being able to go out and talk about conservation with a landowner or another future local government, that's in the back of their minds. Well, you're not making the decision, so why should I listen to you? Kind of a mentality. And then for my 11-member commission as well, I mean, there was just over $50 million of state money that was poured into that effort, not including the local government or Fish and Wildlife Service or anybody else or NRCS. That was our money. And that at the time, they thought that was the good thing to do. We had a willing local government. We had clear direction. If we can do this in the Gunnison Basin, we can prevent the listing. We had the 11 members. I mean, on and on and on, those levels of assurances. Well, now it's one, we probably cannot deal with another greater sage grouse or Gunnison sage grouse conservation issue like this again. This will bankrupt us. I don't think we can spend between 2 bird species is $110 million total of state money. This is state's parks and wildlife money. That's hard to sell to an 11-member commission that has a lot of other burning desire and needs that are going on out there. So having that discussion with them, that's also in their question and in the back of their mind is, well, why should we or why could we? And really what it's boiling down to is the local governments who are willing to partner and that we're not going to leave them behind. It's always been the reason why they're going to continue to look at conservation in the future. But the expectations, the expectations for a not warranted decision, is that enough to entice future financial commitment and those assurances that are going along there? That's certainly from my side and from the state side, that's in the back of several minds. And I think as we've worked in wildlife issues and trust of a whole bunch of species, in particular elk and deer and those other things, that we've got to maintain that ability to continue those discussions with those governments and those landowners. We've got a long standing relationship, and sometimes it's not a good one either. But we've got to put our best foot forward, and we've got to use the best message carrier. And I think in the Gunnison case that the Commissioner Houck was talking about, they were the best. And we sat side saddle to them in the sidecar and let them lead that effort. We're going to continue that effort. And everything the commissioner said is we're going to continue. We believe there's a lot more good that's going on that will continue because they are truly committed to that stewardship. That was the ultimate goal. I think others, if we have a conversation in the future, I think are going to look to this example and the question will come out. And we're just going to have to figure a way to deal with that, all of us together.
Anybody else want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I think I wanted to, maybe speak from the conservation community side of the things. I wasn't personally as directly involved, obviously, as Director Broscheid and Commissioner Houck, but one of the things that I think is worth highlighting that I think were really worth underlining in the comments that both of those gentlemen just made was, I don't think the process was broken for the Gunnison sage grouse. I think the process was working like it should have. It was very collaborative in a lot of ways. The conservation NGO side of the community was instrumental in helping facilitate some of those conversations and keeping productive dialogue moving. I think one of the things that we need to continue working on with Department of Interior and our federal land management agency partners is establishing more upfront vision that introduces enough flexibility to enable that local process to work out. And I think some of the inflexibility around the deadlines stunted what probably would have led to a more robust process running its course and maybe having a different outcome from the Gunnison sage grouse. And so I think that taking lessons learned from that, looking at some of the finer points of the greater sage grouse collaborative process and using those to develop and guide a model that can be implemented for new collaborative conservation efforts across a multitude of species will definitely serve our interests. And I'm not an ESA lawyer, I just play one on TV occasionally. And one of the things that I think is worth looking at is, the definition and interpretation of, a significant portion of the range versus the entire range itself. And if a species is threatened across the entire range, but endangered in a portion of the range, what does that actually mean? And let's take a look at some of the nuts and bolts of the ESA piece, which I'm glad is going to be hopefully talked a lot about more later today in the legal session. But I know that that's something the service is looking forward to, and we want to be good partners with state and local government, but also our federal land management agency partners to take advantage of processes playing out like the Bureau of Land Management's Planning 2.0 process. What can we do to make sure that we have more robust mechanisms in place in the general planning that allows us to look at things like resource management planning across jurisdictions. Let's take a look at neighboring planning processes, and if they're not timed at the same time, what can we do to make sure that we're looking at the regular resource management planning process between Forest Service, BLM, and other places, so that we don't get, like I said before, to that severe point where we're trying to rescue and resuscitate populations in the first place.
Let's, Ethan, let's get out on the ranch here. A couple of questions for you that you can help us with. From a general perspective, what is needed to strike a balance between implementing species conservation measures while maintaining a viable grazing operation? And then I think, we talked about thinking about parts of the ESA like CCAA, safe harbor agreements, 4D stuff. And is that helpful or not, or are there better things we could do in that area? So kind of pick and choose how you want to talk about that.
Well, to your first question, I don't think those two are mutually exclusive. I mean, we've had healthy wildlife populations and grazing for several hundred years in the West. And as a matter of fact, when you look at populations like the sage grouse, I think you've seen a decline in sage grouse along with herds in the West. I mean, grazing represents sort of one of the most essential tools to create habitat, to beat back invasive species, to manage wildfire fuel loads, and to prevent habitat fragmentation and breakup of large landscapes. And as such, I think that they are sort of an absolutely essential partner to create those conditions and let these species thrive. So I don't think the two have to be balanced as much as sort of just treated in a manner that work can be done and can continue without sort of unnecessary outside pressure that derails it. I mean, when you have stakeholders come into the conversation that don't necessarily agree, that you've had management and you've had people on these landscapes for hundreds of years and for thousands of years before that, with the Native Americans doing controlled burns, 5,000 years back. We've been managing landscapes for a very long time, and we're not going to stop anytime soon. So we have to look at what elements in that landscape are critical, and how do we encourage them to, like ranching, how do we encourage the ranchers to make the best decisions possible to optimize the health of the landscape?
How about, I mean, you can choose not to address it if you want, but the question about some of the specific things in the ESA, like CCAA, Safe Harbor, useful context, better ways to approach it?
I think CCAAs provide a lot of benefit. We saw that with the lesser prairie chicken in the range-wide plan, and providing some sort of durability to efforts to conserve a species before listing is necessary, and it provides that certainty that ranchers need in order to plan. I mean, you're talking about significant investment, you're talking about large landscapes, and the ability to have that kind of regulatory certainty to operate is critical. So anytime when they can engage in those processes and attain that certainty, I think it's important. But my earlier point still stands, that I mean, that certainty has to come with some sort of guarantee that when they commit to their side of that and they decide to curtail their practices or amend their practices to enhance habitat or do whatever else, that those efforts are going to be met with good faith by the other side of the coin. So I mean, I think those tools are absolutely useful if there's trust and there's good faith on both sides.
John, you hit some of this already, but I'm going to go negative on you for a minute. You talked about the virtues of landscape scale and multi-species conservation efforts. Can you think of any drawbacks to that approach, or are you pretty much a believer that that's the path that we ought to think about following?
Well, I'm a firm believer that that's the path to follow. I think looking at a landscape level approach to species conservation, habitat conservation is absolutely what needs to happen, and it needs to involve a multitude of stakeholders. I guess some of the two key drawbacks here are the time that it takes to pull those together, which sort of highlights some of the points I made earlier about thinking really far in advance and getting together with partners to identify potential problem areas, to take measures to protect important habitats up front using some of the more innovative tools out there, like Arizona's HabiMap project with Director Broscheid had a significant hand in helping foster along WGA's early days of getting involved in identifying core habitat areas. I think there's a lot of things that we can be doing more of that we're not doing now that help compress that time so it doesn't take as long. The other piece of that is resources for making these things successful. And I think since 1977, we've seen appropriations to federal conservation programs axed in half. We've got a big problem back in Washington, D.C. with getting our appropriators to provide adequate funding to fish and wildlife management agencies, habitat management agencies, and making sure that our state partners, local governments are also a part of that a collaborative process where resources can be shared across jurisdictions to meet shared vision for conservation success. And I think that's critical to helping ensure that things like the HCPs work the right way, to make sure that these candidate conservation agreements work as they should, to fund and fuel new ideas that are more innovative and thoughtful, like mitigation banking, and looking at some of the advancements we're making now. And then I think, the gentleman over here talked about some of the science piece of this to make sure that we are really taking a look at ways to analyze landscapes and identify the most significant threats to that, and having the resources available to conduct those sort of landscape level threat assessments so that we can have that level of analysis needed to inform our decisions. And then as we go along, continue to engage in active habitat management needs, take advantage of new science as it comes along, and be able to implement that without any unnecessary restrictions that would provide or prevent otherwise good things from happening as we are implementing plans that were hashed before. And those are some key areas I think that we need to potentially look at, not as problem areas, but opportunities for improvement and making stronger and getting out in front of before they do become problems.
Anybody else? Gary, go ahead.
I'd offer one thought. The service I think the conservation community as a whole largely recognizes that landscape scale approaches to conservation are the most intelligent way to proceed. But it's not always easy to reconcile that most intelligent, most efficient way for species conservation with the species-specific approach of the Endangered Species Act. It's hard work. I think that our landscape scale regional HCPs that have been developed over the course of the last 20 years are probably one of the best laboratories to see how to do this work, but also to recognize the challenges. Ultimately, under the Act, we still have to look at the needs of individual species, many of which are narrow endemics, for which securing overall ecosystem function may not necessarily address the specific threat to a very narrow endemic. That also has to be addressed in some fashion if you're going to deal with ESA compliance. We can do it, but I don't want anybody to think that it's a simple task and it's something you just wave your wand over. It does take time and energy to bring those two together. And there is certainly a significant level of risk tolerance that has to be part of the overall solution as well.
Ethan.
Actually, my follow-up is for you, Gary, on that. Talking about landscape level, and I don't have necessarily feelings very strongly either way. I think a lot of us are kind of on the fence. I think there are pluses and minuses to it, but can you really have landscape level planning without an acceptance that a natural healthy ecosystem is going to have winners and losers, and you are going to have species that are not necessarily going to thrive on the same level that others do? I mean, can you do that and still landscape plan on a large scale like that?
And that's why I mentioned the risk tolerance. If the standard that we all have is minimize risk for all species to optimize the conservation plan for even the most sensitive and least tolerant, then that's going to be difficult to accomplish those goals. We live in a complicated world, and these are things that almost exceed our ability to process all this information. So there is a certain degree of recognizing that we need to do our best to not let anything purposely fall by the wayside. Save all the pieces is the basic concept here, but we may not be able to optimize management for all the species that are in the mix in the interest of securing at a landscape level a more predictable and secure future for the ecosystem as a whole.
Okay. I've got a question for everybody that I'll throw out here, and then I think we can switch to your questions depending on how long this takes. But I want to give everybody a chance, and it sort of goes forward and backwards to Tocqueville, but to today, and that's voluntary conservation. Americans have always been celebrated for voluntarily joining and doing things, but voluntary conservation, if you're looking at it, how do you incentivize and adequately credit conservation of a species early on? And Gary, this one's tough, but would Fish and Wildlife be able to recognize and reward conservation that far in advance without having to create another layer of regulations and so forth to do it? Are market incentives the answer? To make the incentives happen. There's a lot there, but the theme is voluntary conservation. How do we do it? When is it good? Do we need more than it? And everybody weigh in if you'd like. Or think about it first.
Well, I'd offer some thoughts again. Clearly, effective conservation that involves all those that really influence species futures requires more than a regulatory approach. And voluntary conservation approaches, I think, have been the laboratory with shown the greatest creativity and innovation in the last few years, as well as there's been some tremendous leadership applied. I speak specifically to NRCS. Their focus building this Working Lands for Wildlife initiative to drive significant conservation dollars to the Farm Bill towards species that are at risk has made such a tremendous difference there. But in many cases, landowners do in fact need something more than just altruism to help them accomplish that kind of change in management. Financial assistance, technical assistance is incredibly important. our candidate conservation agreements with assurances, safe harbor agreements, there we're providing regulatory certainty as an incentive, and that's important for some landowners. But there are other landowners, I think, that still need additional assistance. We continue to explore that area where right now we've proposed a policy that would establish that we would accept, for the purposes of mitigation, if a species were ever to be listed, conservation credits that were accrued before the species was listed, creating a market for an economic value in conservation efforts for candidate species. We need to continue to look at all of those things and maybe other incentives. I do think, though, that if we're going to continue to grow the incentives that are important for private landowners in particular to make changes to address conservation needs for species, we're going to have to find some ways to make meaningful incentives for them to do so.
Go ahead. Weigh in.
I would say that, I think that this discussion of what voluntary mitigation and compensation looks like in the West is an important one for everybody to have, particularly when you move into an area like the West where you have so much public land as part of that equation. How do you incentivize landowners to take those sort of best practices to heart and run with them? But how do you also incentivize those landowners that are operating on adjacent public lands to do the same thing? I don't think we've quite found that balance yet. I think the resource management plans and LUPAs that we have on the sage grouse have shown that, because we're sort of balancing that conservation ledger by offloading a lot of the restrictions onto the public land side, when we need to be looking at ways, especially in counties like Jonathan's, where you have north of 80% public land, those people that are operating on those public lands into the process and incentivize them in a positive way, rather than sort of loading them with restrictions in order to get to an outcome that sounds better or feels better or makes everybody feel like we're making progress, when we can have a much more positive exponential effect by looking for ways for that voluntary conservation effort to really extend to everybody that's operating on the landscape.
Other folks?
Yeah, I'd like to second Ethan's comments about extending voluntary conservation to public lands. I think we all recognize that NRCS has done a great job in providing financial assistance and technical assistance on private lands. We haven't seen as much activity on public lands, and in part that's due to not having a multi-year plan specifically for public lands. In part, it's due to funding differences. And I think in the future, BLM will have to budget for voluntary conservation incentives on public land. And again, I think industry needs to play a part in that as well.
Go ahead.
I'll take a little bit different take on the question, because I think the idea was how do we realize these opportunities? And I think one is that the service has a great opportunity, and I'm going to speak again just to the local government piece, is to somehow formalize consultation with local government. Oftentimes when local communities know what they need to do, they'll get it done. What's often the cloud hanging over them is the inability to have very direct, focus here, don't focus there. These kind of projects are priority, these are not. Because when communities can prioritize projects, they can go and seek funding and they can move those things forward. That's the actionable items on the ground. And so getting way ahead is how does, ecological services is a regulatory, it fulfills a regulatory mission. But how does it get ahead of those? How does it create those opportunities? In our situation, we had an 11 county agreement, which will be interesting to compare what all the counties said. We're willing to do all of these things and continue these forward. And here's new programs, here's new opportunities. It'll be interesting to weigh what was offered voluntarily by communities, by counties, by towns, by agencies, with what the recovery plan will eventually look like. Because don't you want to take that opportunity when it's out in front and everyone's behind it, rather than it being kind of forced and on the back end? So how do we, and I think there's been good examples. I think the bi-state population of the greater sage grouse was a great example of that collaborative effort, and it happened. So how does that become more institutionalized in how the service to the state, to the local communities, how does that interaction look? So it's good to see there's examples there, and I think that finding a way to make that more of the norm and is something that I would like to see.
Go ahead.
I want to attempt to marginally paraphrase all the eloquent comments here at the table on this front, but I do want to say that I think voluntary conservation measures are really important, and incentivizing them is equally important. But I think there's a degree of public education that needs to take place. We need to be able to inform people about what's available and empower them to participate in the process. I think that sometimes existing regulatory processes are daunting for the general public. And speaking on behalf of an organization that is a member-based organization, we try and do that with our own members to explain why we're engaging and how we're doing that. And so I think that, maybe as a follow-up to this meeting, I'd love to figure out a way to package all of these conservation programs together and identify the sort of voluntary citizen engagement pieces of this that could help advance the type of landscape level conservation work that we're doing, educate people through some sort of citizen's guide to conservation engagement on public and private lands both, and create some sort of comprehensive way that educates the public, encourages them to be a part of the process, and creates true engagement that not only empowers, local county governments, state governments, federal agencies, but also makes the person on the ground who may not know what they should be doing and how they should be doing it feel like there's someone there that is helping them out. And then, back to my prior comments about ensuring there's adequate funding to make that happen. I think that's absolutely important. Growing up in a ranching kid and spending as much time putting calves on the ground as I did fishing lines in the water and boots on the hillside chasing big game. I think hunters know that they're sort of the original conservationists, and we sort of wear that as a badge of honor, and it's something that it's a level of pride that you can't tattoo on your arm. And so I think that human element is there. We just have to point it in the right direction and help them out.
Let's get the mics. Raise your hands. I want to give enough time as I can now for questions from all of you folks, and there's one already. Remember to identify yourself too.
Amos Eno, Resources First Foundation. I often marvel at sort of the lack of coordination of federal government agencies, or sometimes maybe even collusion in this case. But when you're dealing with, almost every speaker we've heard today has focused on the importance of private landowners. And at the Sage Grouse Conference in Salt Lake 2 years ago, we had the same emphasis from virtually every single speaker. So my question is, for example, to Ethan to start with, and Carey, and then maybe Gary, given the importance of private landowners, their stewardship, what they're bringing to the equation today, how does your constituency feel when the administration's raising AUM levels and the prices on grazing, particularly on public lands? And for Carey, for a company like ConocoPhillips that's been providing funds to Fish and Wildlife Services, joint ventures for NAWCA and NIFWIF for over 20 years, what does it look like for you as you get increased regulations when you're a exemplary player on public lands? And Gary, I know it's not your program, but at the time you're listing species on private lands, why is the partner's budget flat or down for now like 7 straight years? And shouldn't all of those be part of the equation for endangered species, particularly like Ethan to speak to the impact on private landowners from some of the increased regulation and fees?
Man, Amos, I got to catch a flight tomorrow. To the AUM question, I'm assuming you're speaking to the grazing fee increase. We're supportive of the formula that informs that fee. I don't know how old the data was from NASS that informed this most current increase, but the market-based formula is intended to reflect conditions on the ground, and we're certainly supportive of that. I think that fee only tells part of the story. And I think when you see initiatives like in the president's budget this year, the BLM is asking for a $2.50 per AUM surcharge to sort of offload their responsibility for rangeland management expenses. It sort of ignores the rest of the contribution that permittees make to managing those resources. If our members weren't doing the work that they're doing on those lands, somebody else would have to do it, and somebody else would have to pay for it. Right now, those costs are being borne by permittees. So it really only tells, and that doesn't even get into the obvious regulatory burdens that a private land lessee is not dealing with on their resources. So I think there's a lot more to that equation that's probably not given its full due in the discussion. But I mean, as for the underlying AUM per AUM fee, I mean, we're supportive of the basic formula.
That was a three-part question, so you remember the second part of it?
I don't remember the second part of it, sorry.
I don't think it was for you, it was for somebody.
Yeah, so for the second part, how does ConocoPhillips feel when faced with a lot of new regulations? I think Governor Mead put it best today. If there's a listing, it's because of some failure in planning on our collective parts. Fortunately, with sage grouse, we didn't have a listing, and I think applying the same model with a higher level of effort on federal land can keep us out of trouble with other species.
I think you were part three.
So the simplest question, I guess, but maybe difficult answer. The Fish and Wildlife Service is a relatively small agency. We have about 8,000 people. We have 1,000 people less than we did 4 years ago. We have a level of funding and resources that's about where we were back in 2000. It's the environment that we work in right now. We went through a very significant economic reversal. We have constrained domestic spending for all agencies. The fact that we have level funding for our Partners program reflects the priority we place on that program, because there are lots of parts of the Fish and Wildlife Service that we had back 5 years ago that are no longer being done. We're making as intelligent decisions as we can, working with the limited resources that Congress makes available to us to do our job. Every year we have budget requests that seek more so that we can be more effective, so that we can be more engaged, so we accomplish more. We have not generally been successful in that over the course of the last number of years. We're going to continue to try, but it's the environment that we work in.
Another question.
Brian Rutledge, National Audubon again. I'm going to wander a bit in asking this question, but I think it's important. We continually refer to the costs of so much of what we do. And I remember in the early parts of the sage grouse discussion, it was what would a listing cost the states? How much would it hit their budget? And what's real here that we need to, I think, talk about is how we anticipate those costs by doing a better job of planning. We have very productive public and private lands in the West that contribute greatly to the economy. The vast majority of what comes out in royalties on the federal lands ends up in general budgets, whether federal or state. A blue ribbon panel led by our old friend Dave Friedenthal has just made a recommendation that a percentage of those royalties be directed to these sorts of planning and conservation efforts to the tune of about $1.3 billion a year. I want to get some reaction to the board to this proactive approach to anticipating and dealing with these problems prior to a listing.
Go away. Whoever wants, go ahead.
Well, I'm all for it. So you definitely get my vote, but I'm glad you brought that up, Brian. The Blue Ribbon panel of Governor Friedenthal and Johnny Morse, co-chair, and a whole bunch of industry partners sat down, and that was the recommendation, that 1.3 billion. And just to put that in perspective, that's just about 75% of the needs that were identified in all of the state wildlife action plans will be met by that number. So certainly proactive, get ahead, managing all species out there. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier is what we've got now. You just heard what Gary's budgets are looking like. It's not going to be borne on the local governments to pick this up, or industry. It's going to be collective, all of us. And this was a recommendation that seems to be getting real favorable review, and we continue to hope it goes forward. This is the offshore oil and gas money, as well as the mineral revenues you mentioned, Brian, and this is just about 10% of that pot of money that sits in Treasury that is not appropriated. So they thought that would be pretty good chunk of money to at least get the ball started. But again, it's still not going to be enough, but at least it's a really, really good start.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think Brian raises a good point, and I'm glad he drew attention to the Blue Ribbon panel as well. One of the major challenges I think that faces Fish and Wildlife Conservation is to expand the
to him. I think maybe we can just take one more, but we'll see how this goes.
Okay. Thank you. Pat O'Toole, Family Farm Alliance. I'm a rancher in northwest Colorado and southern Wyoming. When I'm not running the meetings, and I know an awful lot of you, and going to too many meetings lately, I like to study history. And the worst example, when you read a lot of history, is fighting the last war. And I look at this room and people on that panel that I've known and worked with, and I know we can figure this stuff out. The problem is, any of you know about what's happening in the Deschutes Irrigation District in Oregon, where Center for Biological Diversity and others are suing to take all the water away from that irrigation district. And it's going to be celebrated at the White House in a couple of weeks as one of the most progressive places where people have done both water and wildlife and food production. And I think, we are on a path. I've been to every one of the Western Governors meetings to be solution oriented. But I think without understanding the fundamental flaw of the litigators driving the process, we're really not going to make much progress. And I think when the governor talked about all the steps, there's a lot of steps to get to the ultimate solution. But if we're not thinking that way, we're never going to get to the ultimate solution.
Anybody want to tell us how we can avoid litigation? Which we all want to do, I'm sure. Or I won't call on any of you either. Well, somebody have one more question they really want to get out there? Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Chris Siegel. I'm a lawyer in Washington, D.C. I work for Lowell Bear, who couldn't be here this week. I think this follows right on to what Pat was just saying, because I think I know his answer. But I wondered if each member of the panel could very briefly, in a few words, say what they foresee as the largest single challenge in the next 2 to 5 years for this sort of voluntary conservation.
Besides the election? You can give it a shot. I know we're forecasting, so fine.
Go ahead, Bob.
Oh, okay. I'll say just one. Probably funding. I think litigation's another. And to Pat's point is, we're finding ourselves embroiled in litigation. I mean, it's part of the game now. And for us to have attorneys who are engaged in litigation of the Endangered Species Act issues, that's something we haven't done in the past, and we've got to work in some cases, helping the service from those sorts of CBD lawsuits and others, and others who sometimes we disagree too. But I think our ability to find that next fund source to accomplish the litigation, to accomplish conservation goals, to help out landowners, those types of things. I guess I would wrap that all under one umbrella. From my view.
Go ahead.
So I think funding is always going to be a big barrier, and this is sort of the flip side of the level of funding, efficiency of execution, how far we can stretch the funding we do have is a challenge.
I'll agree with litigation. Until we solve that puzzle, the rest of this is really academic to a certain extent, because we're just not able to adequately deal with any of these issues.
I hate it when people say that's academic.
Sorry.
God, we feel bad. Kidding. Anybody else? Yes.
I think, I was asked to represent local government on this panel, and I'll say one thing that concerns me as we move into the future and what these things look like is that I think for small, especially rural local communities, a lot of them have seen examples of where communities have really gone the distance to no avail. And I'm worried about when we hit that tipping point of local communities not even starting to engage, to say, you know what, regardless of what we do, it won't move the needle. That's a big concern for me.
Well, we just went an hour and 20 minutes just talking and answering questions and listening, not having a bunch of just canned presentations. That's pretty good, I think. So join me in thanking the panel. And wait. I kind of have to tee up what's happening after